Happy Friday, everybody. Hope you've had a great week. We have been walking through a story here on the Daily Drive all this week from Daniel chapter 3. You can find it in the Old Testament section of the Bible. And just to kind of refresh, we're talking about these three guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were high officials in the empire of Babylon. Well, they catch the ire of their egomaniac boss, King Nebuchadnezzar, for not bowing down to this 9-story golden god that he had set up and commanded everybody in the kingdom to bow down to. Well, these guys worship the only true and living God, and in spite of the threat of execution, they don't bow down. They remain standing. And we left off yesterday with Nebuchadnezzar having them thrown into a blazing furnace with a sneer about the God that they worshipped. Well, let's pick it up in verse 24. But suddenly, as he was watching, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisers, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, we did, Your Majesty." "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire. They aren't even hurt by the flames, and the 4th looks like a divine being." That'd be Jesus. Verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Let me read that again. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the princes, prefects, governors, and advisers crowded around them, and they saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. Man, every time I read that, it gives me goosebumps. And I love a couple of things in there. Remember how they had been tied up and thrown into the fire? And then how the king saw that they were now walking around unbound? Their bodies had not been harmed. Their robes had not been scorched. Not even the hairs on their heads had been singed. The only things that got burned up were the ropes that held them back. And to me, that's such a cool picture, because I believe there are times that God will allow you and me to go through a fire to set us free. Maybe it was some kind of bondage to a habit or an addiction that had you bound up, tied up for so many years. And maybe the fire was even a consequence of your own bad decisions. But how many of us have gone through a fire that forced us to humble ourselves and finally lean into God? And the result was those things that held us back got burned away, and we were finally free. The other thing I love is what is said in verse 27, that there was no smell of fire on them. The Amplified Bible puts it this way, nor had even the smell of smoke clung to them. That's pretty amazing. I mean, I can roast marshmallows on a campfire or have fajitas at a restaurant and smell like smoke for a week, right? It just clings to me. But on the other side of this fire, even the smell of smoke had not clung to them. You know, some people who have been through tough stuff go through their life angry, bitter, always playing the victim card. But there are other people who have gone through a fire and you would never know it because they don't go around smelling like smoke. I think of a friend whose husband had an affair several years ago. It was an intense fire, lots of pain, lots of trust rebuilding. Didn't result in a restoration of the marriage, but God walked with her through the fire. And these days, she doesn't even smell like smoke. I think of another friend who was neck deep in an eating disorder when she was younger, but God walked through the fire with her, and these days you'd never know it because she doesn't even smell like smoke. I think of a guy who I know who was abused by his dad countless times, but you'd never know it because God brought healing to his heart, and these days he doesn't even smell like smoke. I mean, only God can bring us through a fire and write a new story with our lives. What happens in that furnace is simply supernatural. I mean, there's no other explanation. I mean, this is Red Sea parting, Gideon's army, walk on the water, resurrection from the dead kind of stuff. And Nebuchadnezzar recognizes it. Check this out, verse 28. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's commands and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree. If any people whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be crushed into heaps of rubble. He hadn't caught the compassion thing yet, because there is no other God who can rescue like this. And then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. So what is it that keeps you from living with deep conviction? What keeps you from having the confidence to live the kind of full life that Jesus came to give you? There's a few good, honest questions we all need to ask ourselves, such as, what would I do if I weren't afraid? That's a great question to ask yourself. What would I do if I weren't afraid? As well as, what other things besides God am I bowing down to these days? What kind of ropes have me bound? What needs to be burned away in my life? From what do I need to be rescued from? And if you're going through a fire right now, you need to know that someone is in the fire with you too, and his name is Jesus. And whether it's from the fire, or through the fire, or by the fire, he will deliver you. And I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll catch you back here on Monday.